You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music. In April of 2007, a 31-year-old woman woke up from a nap on her couch and rubbed her eyes. But instead of feeling rested and refreshed, she felt even worse than when she'd gone to sleep. She had a pounding headache, and the light that was coming through her window seemed impossibly bright. Her mouth was dry from thirst, and hunger pangs racked her stomach. The woman stretched and sat up. She was sore all over. It hurt just to reach for her phone on the coffee table. She turned her phone on, and when she saw the time and date, her eyes went wide. She'd slept for 53 hours straight. The woman tried to resist the fear that was now rising in her mind. She hadn't had anything to eat or drink in days. Her body had been wasting away while she slept, and she'd been powerless to break free. If this happened again, she might never wake up. From Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you enjoyed today's story, please bring a to-go container to the Follow Button's wedding and use it to pack up the entire cake before the bride and groom have any. This episode is called Sleep Addict. In the fall of 2005, 29-year-old lawyer Anna Sumner leaned her elbows against her large wooden desk and stared at her computer screen. It was hard not to let her mind wander. She could see downtown Atlanta, Georgia, right from her office window. Anna yawned and stretched and then forced her eyelids to stay open. It was already 5 p.m., but she still had an important brief to finish before she could go home. Her attention wandered again, this time to the framed diplomas that hung on her wall. She had an undergraduate degree from Princeton, and she had received her law degree from Duke. She'd studied very hard in school and now had worked her way up the ranks at a very prestigious law firm. She was proud of everything she'd accomplished. Anna leaned back in her chair and kicked off her high heels. She was exhausted. Then again, she was always exhausted. In high school, she used to skip hanging out with friends just to go to bed early, which left her feeling totally isolated. During college, she routinely skipped breakfast to sleep in, and then showed up to class so hungry she couldn't even focus. Once, she'd flown cross-country for a friend's wedding, and then accidentally slept through the entire thing. Finding the energy to get through law school had been a constant struggle, and it was even harder as a young lawyer at a big firm where so much was expected of new people. Sometimes she feared that her constant fatigue was damaging the career she had sacrificed so much for. It was beyond frustrating. Anna had slept for at least 12 hours the night before, yet here she was, not feeling rested. It was like she was moving through a fog at all times. She always needed more sleep, but she knew she needed to keep working. Anna stood up and shook her arms, trying to get her blood moving. She opened her eyes as wide as she could. She shook her head back and forth and sat back down, determined to finish her work. But as soon as she started to type, her eyelids grew heavy again, and Anna nodded off, her cheek resting on the keyboard. The next thing Anna knew, she was slowly waking up. Her back ached from being hunched over in her chair. Her computer screen had gone to sleep too. She shook the mouse and the screen lit up, and she looked at the time. It was 6 a.m. Anna had just slept for 13 hours. She was completely disoriented, still wearing yesterday's clothes, and her brief was not finished. Anna immediately felt a knot form in her throat. She had been successfully hiding her sleepiness problem ever since she was a teenager when it began. She'd always been able to arrange her schedule to accommodate her constant need to sleep. But now that she had a job with a lot of responsibilities, she just didn't have that same flexibility. Anna had always prided herself on having a good work ethic and self-control, but now she realized that this was something she really just couldn't control. Sometimes when Anna felt really tired, she would think to herself, if I don't sleep right now, I feel like I could actually die. She knew that was not normal. This problem had gone on long enough, and it wasn't going to get better unless she sought out some help. A few days later, Anna drove to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center in Atlanta. It was inside an old, faded building undergoing significant renovations. In fact, there was still construction going on outside. Anna plugged her ears as she walked past jackhammers slamming into concrete. She checked in, and a few moments later, a gray-haired, round-faced doctor walked her back to a large exam room with chairs and a bed. He adjusted his glasses and then introduced himself as Dr. David Rye, the lead neurologist at the clinic. He motioned for Anna to take a seat and asked her about her symptoms. And she told him that she basically craved sleep the same way a drug addict craves a fix. No matter how much she slept, she never felt rested, and the constant exhaustion was totally debilitating. Dr. Rye nodded understandingly and suggested they begin with a very basic test. He asked Anna to simply take a nap, right there in the exam room. And so Anna laid down on the bed. She could still hear the loud construction noises going on outside, but it didn't bother her. Within moments, she was asleep. But just a few minutes later, Dr. Rye shook her awake, and then he diagnosed her with a disorder called hypersomnia. This is a catch-all term for extreme, unexplained sleepiness. It's thought that up to 5% of the entire population experiences it, though rarely at the level Anna was. So while it was a diagnosis, it really wasn't that specific. But for Anna, who'd never seen a doctor for her sleep problems before, having any diagnosis was progress, and she was even more optimistic when Dr. Rye suggested a treatment plan. He explained that in most cases, extreme tiredness is caused by a lack of energy-promoting chemicals in the brain, with names like dopamine and norepinephrine. It's like having a car with no gas in the tank. So he prescribed stimulants for Anna. These medications increase the level of these energy-promoting chemicals the same way that caffeine does. For patients like Anna, it can feel like they have a full tank of gas again. And Anna was so excited about her stimulants that after she left the doctor's office, she went straight to the pharmacy. When she got there, a pharmacist handed her a paper bag with a couple of prescription bottles inside, and Anna didn't waste any time getting her first dose. Sitting in her car in the parking lot, she opened one of the bottles, shook a pill into her hand, and swallowed it. She couldn't wait to feel better. A few months later, Anna grabbed a stack of papers off the desk in her office. Her hands shook slightly as she slipped the papers into her shoulder bag. She stood up from her desk chair, and suddenly a wave of nausea washed over her. She'd taken her prescription stimulants that morning and had been taking them every day since Dr. Rye prescribed them. In some ways, the stimulants were working. She could get through a full day of work without needing a nap, but the side effects from the medication were terrible. She felt jittery and sick to her stomach, like she'd had way too many cups of coffee. She was losing weight because she never had any appetite. And even though she had felt kind of okay for a while on this medication, she was now starting to crave sleep again. As she walked outside and unlocked her car, all Anna could think about was getting home and going to bed. She got into her car, pulled out her phone, and called Dr. Rye. She told him about the side effects she was feeling and now how her craving for sleep was starting to come back. Dr. Rye assured her that this was actually normal. He told Anna her body was building up a tolerance to the drugs, and he'd simply prescribe her a higher dose. Anna was nervous about this. The stimulants were already giving her such bad side effects, and she thought taking more would really only make her feel worse. But at the same time, the medication was the only thing allowing her to make it through the day. So Anna agreed to the higher dose. She hung up, drove to the pharmacy, and picked up more medication. One year later, on a Friday in April of 2007, Anna was wrapping up her work for the week when the phone on her desk rang. It was her boss. He wanted her to come up to his office before she went home. Anna's hand trembled as she set down the receiver. She wasn't sure if the trembling was from a side effect of the stimulants or from nerves from what her boss just asked her to do. She knew what this conversation was going to be about, and she'd been dreading it for months. Anna had begun missing entire days of work without warning and without explanation. Even though she was constantly taking all of her stimulants, it wasn't uncommon for Anna to still literally sleep days away. Sometimes she'd go to bed and sleep for 20, 25, or even 30 hours straight. It didn't matter how many alarms she set either. Anna slept through all of them, only waking up when her body finally let her. Anna got up from her chair and her legs felt heavy. Even now, with adrenaline coursing through her body, All Anna wanted to do was sleep. It took all her strength to trudge down the hall to her boss's corner office. She knocked on the door, and then, in a somber tone, her boss asked her to come inside. Anna sat down across from his desk and tried to stay composed. She felt angry at her body for betraying her. She'd put in so many years of hard work, and she was sure that it was all about to slip away. But Anna's boss didn't fire her. He reassured Anna that he valued her contributions, but he was really concerned about her health. Though Anna rarely talked about it, her boss was quite aware of her sleep issue, and so he recommended that she take a 6-month leave of absence so she could get to the bottom of it. Anna didn't want to do this. She wanted to keep working, but she knew that taking this leave of absence was probably the right thing to do. If she couldn't be consistently relied on, she wouldn't be helping the firm, her clients, or herself. So she thanked her boss for understanding and promised to do everything she could to get back to work soon. The next afternoon, Anna was lying on her couch at home, trying to make sense of her struggles. She sipped on a cup of coffee and tried to watch TV, but as usual, she couldn't stop herself from nodding off. This time, though, waking up was worse than ever. Her head was pounding and the light coming in through the blinds seemed overwhelmingly bright. She had sharp hunger pangs in her stomach, and her joints felt stiff, and her muscles were weak and shaky. It took all her effort just to roll onto her side. She saw the TV had shut off, and the cup of coffee she'd just been drinking was now totally cold, and the cream inside of the coffee was clearly rotten and curdled at the top of the cup. Anna was confused and grabbed her phone on the coffee table, and she checked the time and date. And what she saw literally did not seem possible. According to the time, Anna had just slept for 53 hours straight. It had been over 2 days since she'd laid down on the couch, but it felt like, a second had passed. Staring at the date and time on her phone, she felt sick. Her symptoms were really starting to frighten her. How long would she sleep the next time? A week? More? How could she live anything like a normal life if this was what happened to her? She called Dr. Rye's office immediately, and he thankfully had an immediate appointment available. As Anna dragged herself off the couch and walked out to her car, she felt weak and clumsy. Walking was like trying to pull her body through sludge these days. She gingerly lowered herself into the driver's seat and then drove straight to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center. Before long, Anna was in that familiar exam room, sitting across from Dr. Rye. He seemed surprised to see her, but when she told him about falling asleep for 53 hours straight, his eyes went wide. Dr. Rye knew that spending so much time asleep could actually be dangerous. It meant Anna wasn't eating, drinking water, or exercising for days at a time. In the long term, this could lead to malnutrition, dehydration, and muscle atrophy. If she wasn't able to take care of herself, her body would eventually quit working. However, Dr. Rye said he did have an idea for what they could do next. It was a last-ditch effort and something he would not recommend unless it was absolutely an emergency, and clearly this was that. There was a test that could help them figure out what was causing her to sleep so much, but for it to be accurate, she needed to stop taking all the stimulants he'd been prescribing. Anna leaned back in her seat after hearing this. She knew the stimulants weren't perfect. No matter the dosage, she always needed more, and she was still sleeping way too much. But at the same time, the idea of not taking them scared her. If she could sleep for 53 hours with stimulants in her system, what would happen to her without stimulants? But in Dr. Rye's opinion, getting rid of the stimulants might be the only way to figure out what was happening inside of her brain. It would take about a month for the drugs to clear her system, so the doctor scheduled an appointment for a month from then, in May. Until then, the doctor explained to Anna that she really needed to be careful. Once she stopped taking these stimulants, she shouldn't drive, just in case she fell asleep behind the wheel, and she should have someone looking after her, making sure she ate, drank, and moved around every day. Anna realized that what the doctor was saying was, without these stimulants, she could not live alone anymore. And so, after she made it home from the clinic, she called her parents, who lived in Mississippi, and she told them she needed their help. Her parents immediately agreed, and her mother said she'd come to stay with Anna in Atlanta for as long as she needed. Anna was relieved to hear this, but at the same time, she was so tired she could barely function. She felt like she was literally sleeping her life away. A month later, in May of 2007, Anna's mom helped her get into the passenger seat of her car. With no stimulants in her system, Anna felt even more lethargic and totally confused. All she knew on this day was that they were going to the sleep clinic to see Dr. Rye. The whole ride, Anna sat with her head leaned against the window, watching trees and buildings blur together as she slipped in and out of consciousness. When they got to the Emory Clinic Sleep Center, Anna felt so stiff and heavy that her mom had to help her get out of the car. Anna could barely keep her eyes open as she leaned on her mom's arm, and then she shuffled her way into the clinic, feeling like she had cinder blocks stuck to her feet. Dr. Rye met Anna in the waiting area and walked her back to an exam room. They sat down, Dr. Rye in a chair and Anna on the bed. And as soon as Anna was sitting down, she started to feel herself beginning to fall asleep. As she struggled to stay awake, Dr. Rye explained the procedure they'd be doing that day. He said sleep was largely controlled by a person's brain. The brain uses nerves and chemicals to send messages through the rest of the body, and if the balance of these chemicals is thrown off, it could make someone sleep far too little or far too much. Dr. Rye thought this could be what was happening to Anna, but he needed to analyze the fluid inside her spinal cord to be sure. This meant he would need to insert a needle into the base of her spine and withdraw some of the fluid, a procedure known as a spinal tap. Dr. Rye instructed Anna to lay down on the bed in the fetal position with her back facing him. Then he injected a local anesthetic near her spine, and Anna's back went numb. Then Anna began to feel pressure and a burning sensation as Dr. Rye inserted the needle into her spine and removed a sample of her cerebrospinal fluid. When the procedure was over, Dr. Rye told Anna it would take a few days for the results to come back. And so Anna stood, her back numb and her whole body exhausted, and she shuffled out to the waiting room where her parents were sitting. Then the parents helped Anna out to the car, they got inside, and they drove back to Anna's house in Atlanta. Anna barely made it inside before she collapsed into bed and fell asleep. A few days later, Dr. Rye was getting ready to leave work to head home when one of his assistants rushed inside and told him that the results of Anna's test had come in. Dr. Rye adjusted his glasses and then peered down at the data on his computer screen. He reviewed the chemical breakdown of Anna's cerebrospinal fluid, and what he saw shocked him so much that he called over other doctors to take a look. Every sleep specialist at the clinic was totally surprised. The results were so bizarre that one doctor even started laughing at the absurdity of the numbers they were seeing. They had literally never seen anything like this. But while the other doctors stood in disbelief, Dr. Rye felt a mixture of hope and unease. He had seen results like this before, in an Italian sleep study from the 1990s. In that study, a group of people who had symptoms similar to Anna's were given an experimental drug that cured their sleepiness. It was a drug that Dr. Rye had on hand, which meant he might be able to use it to cure Anna too. But there were problems that made Dr. Rye hesitant. That Italian study had been discredited after the research was found to have some serious issues. Plus, the drug used in that study to cure their sleepiness was never approved by the Food and Drug Administration to treat sleep disorders, and it could cause bad side effects like seizures, so giving it to Anna would definitely be a risk. But faced with Anna's spinal tap results, Dr. Rye thought the risk was worth it, and so he called Anna and told her that he might be able to treat her sleepiness, but they need to do one more test. The next month, in June of 2007, Anna came back to the Emory Clinic. She'd been off the stimulants now for 2 months, and it felt like her body was close to shutting down on her, like she'd never be able to do anything except sleep again. Every footstep she took was a total battle. She dragged herself into the exam room and crawled into the bed. She felt a nurse lift her arm, swab near her wrist, and then jab her with an IV needle. Anna was vaguely aware of other movement in the room. Multiple nurses were standing by, just in case Anna had a bad reaction to the drug, like a seizure or worse. Anna watched as Dr. Rye rolled a screen into the room. Everything looked slightly blurry to her. She heard Dr. Rye say they were doing a test to measure her brain's reaction time, and then he put a remote in her hand and told her to press the button as soon as she saw numbers appear on this screen. Anna tried to follow his instructions, but at the same time, she felt herself drifting in and out of consciousness, and so when a number popped up, she would press the button like she was told to, but she could tell by the look on Dr. Rye's face that she was not doing a good job. After the test was over, Dr. Rye told Anna that her reaction times were similar to someone who had just been up all night, or who had been drinking very heavily. And so now that they had these control results, they could try the medication that Dr. Rye hoped would help her. Anna watched as Dr. Rye put something into her IV bag. The liquid dripped through the tube into her arm and into her bloodstream. But Anna didn't feel any better. Her head felt like a lead weight. Her eyes were so dry that they burned, and the whole room seemed foggy. It took everything in her not to slump over and let her eyes close. For a moment, she had a horrible feeling that this new treatment was not going to work. She would never be able to hold a job or even live by herself again. Then she heard Dr. Rye's voice at her side saying he was going to try a higher dose of this drug. Anna struggled to take a deep breath. She waited for something to happen. Then her eyelids snapped open. The room came into focus, and Anna felt like she could hear and see again, and she didn't feel a desperate urge to sleep. Dr. Rye ran the reaction time test again, and Anna didn't have to work to focus on the screen. The reflex test that had seemed impossible before felt very simple now. When they were finished, Anna looked up at Dr. Rye, close to tears, and she told him she felt alive. For the first time in her adult life, Anna felt truly awake. Dr. Rye watched Anna for a moment. In all the time he'd known her, he'd never seen her look this alert. She sat up straight, her eyes were clear and focused, and she was smiling at him. He couldn't help but smile back. It was incredible to see how much of a difference this drug was making. Dr. Rye sat down next to Anna and told her that he had never seen a patient like her before. Her brain was basically full of naturally occurring anesthesia. He explained that there's a chemical messenger in everyone's brains known as GABA, G-A-B-A, that helps regulate sleep. Many sleep aids and drugs used for surgical anesthesia make the brain respond more strongly to GABA. The stronger the response, the sleepier a person gets, Dr. Rye said. And the reason Anna's doctors were so shocked by her test results was because her naturally occurring GABA activity levels were as high as a person who was about to go into surgery. Every day of her life, 24 hours a day, Anna was walking around with the same level of sedation as a person about to have all their wisdom teeth removed. Dr. Rye watched Anna's jaw drop as she realized that she hadn't just been tired for most of her life. Her own brain had been literally knocking her out. This drug that Dr. Rye had given her was called flumazenil. Usually, flumazenil is used in hospitals to help people who are overdosing on sedatives or having trouble waking up from anesthesia. It's an emergency antidote for people whose GABA activity is too high. So for Anna, whose GABA activity was always too high, flumazenil made her brain function like a healthy person's brain. But the FDA never approved flumazenil for excessive sleepiness. The drug only came as an intravenous medication for use in hospitals, and the effects wore off really quickly. Anna would need to have intravenous injections every few hours to stay awake, and that just wasn't possible from a practical standpoint. So Dr. Rye worked with Anna and the drug maker over the next 8 months to get an exemption from the FDA that would allow her to take a daily flumazenil pill to prevent her sleepiness. The medication completely changed Anna's life. She's since gone back to work, been promoted to partner at the big prestigious law firm in Atlanta, and is enjoying what she calls, quote, the luxury of life. On the morning of Saturday, November 18th, 1961, a 23-year-old man named Michael Rockefeller reached down and grabbed the pull cord that was connected to the outboard motor that was on the boat that Michael was riding in. And Michael, he pulled and pulled on that cord, but he could not get this engine to restart. It just sputtered and wouldn't turn over. And without power, that meant that Michael and his small crew just continued to drift farther and farther out to sea. But that wasn't even the worst of this situation. The boat that Michael and his crew were on, which was a 40-foot-long catamaran, it was 2 handcrafted canoes tied together, well, it was starting to sink. Minutes before, Michael and his crew had been happily traveling along the beautiful green jungled coast of New Guinea when they had to cross over this area where the water was particularly turbulent. There was this river in New Guinea that was feeding out to the Arafura Sea, which is where Michael and his crew were, and where this brown river met the blue water, it became very choppy with lots of rough waves. And so as Michael and his crew tried to cross that area, the waves came on board, they flooded the engine, it shut off, and then as more and more waves landed inside the boat began to sink. The reason why Michael and his crew were even out here and taking these chances to begin with is because Michael wanted to go see this tribe called the Asmats that lived in New Guinea, basically right past this area where this river was. They lived right on the coast. Michael was obsessed with the artwork that the Asmat tribe created, in particular, the very unique bis pole. These poles are created by the master carvers within the Asmat tribe. What they do is they take a single piece of wood and they etch it away until it looks like it's a bunch of men standing on each other's shoulders. Now, these bis poles are totally beautiful and intricate and wonderful to look at, but the Asmat tribe doesn't make them for art. They make them because they believe they contain the souls of the warriors from their tribe who have been killed in combat. And until the Asmats avenge these downed warriors, basically until the tribe kills their enemies, these souls remain trapped in these bis poles, which means the Asmats don't really ever get rid of these poles. They don't sell them. They don't throw them away. They are just part of their culture and society. But months ago, Michael had come and visited the Asmat tribe. He had learned about these bis poles and what they meant, and he believed he had successfully negotiated a deal where he would barter some of his own goods in order to get one of their bis poles. But even though Michael gave them all the things he had offered, they had not in return sent the bis pole. And so now Michael was coming back to hopefully be able to claim the bis pole and take it with him. But as Michael sat in his sinking catamaran, watching the muddy shores of New Guinea get farther and farther away as he drifted farther and farther out into the Arafura Sea, the last thing on his mind was the bis pole. He needed to figure out what they were going to do. Michael's crew consisted of 3 other people. There was a French anthropologist named Rene, and there were 2 teenagers who were actually Asmat guides, and their names were Simon and Leo. And so after Michael was unable to start the engine up, all 3 of them took their turn yanking on the cord, but they too could not get it to start. Finally, Simon and Leo spoke up, and they said to Michael and Rene that at this point they believed their only hope was abandoning the catamaran, jumping into the ocean, and swimming to shore, which for now was about a half-mile away, but they were drifting so quickly out to sea that if they waited any longer, they might be too far away to actually make that swim. But Rene was not a good swimmer at all, and Michael was just not ready to totally abandon ship and leave this thing out here to sink, because on board the catamaran was all this stuff he had brought along, like tobacco and fishing line and clothes and candy and all this different stuff that he knew this tribe wouldn't have, and he could use it as leverage to continue bartering to get his bis pole and to get other artwork they might be offering. And so even though Michael understood that obviously this catamaran and everything on it is going to sink into the ocean at some point, he just wasn't there mentally to jump off now and just kind of abandon all this stuff. And so a decision was made that the 2 Asmat guides, the 2 teenagers, Simon and Leo, they on their own would jump out, swim to shore, and try to get help, while Michael and Rene stayed back and waited for that help to come. And so a few moments later, the 2 teenagers jumped into the water and began their long swim to shore. And as they did, Michael watched, and it suddenly dawned on him just how far away he was from his own home. It had been months since Michael had last showered, so he smelled terrible. He was totally sunburned and caked in dirt, and his hands were rough and calloused from all the rowing he was doing. But this was not really Michael's real life, because Michael was not from New Guinea or from anywhere near here. He was actually from America, where his family was one of the most well-known, influential, and richest families ever. Like in the history of humanity, the Rockefeller family are in like the top 10 of the most powerful people ever. Michael's grandfather was the oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller, who at the time was literally the richest man in the world, and Michael's father, Nelson Rockefeller, was at the time the governor of New York and the future vice president of the United States. But despite having these unbelievable resources at his disposal, Michael was not compelled to kind of be a Rockefeller. Instead, he found his calling in the wilds of New Guinea. He had first come here 7 months earlier with a team of Harvard University filmmakers who were looking to document a very remote tribe. And Michael just fell in love with the adventure of this trip, even though on this trip, while they were filming a battle between this remote tribe and another tribe, Michael got shot accidentally in the shoulder with an arrow. So despite being wounded effectively in combat, Michael just loved being in New Guinea. In fact, Michael actually never told his family about getting shot in the shoulder with this arrow because he was worried if he told his family, the all-powerful Rockefeller family, they would respond by seeking out retribution against one of these tribes that had inadvertently harmed Michael Rockefeller. And so Michael was just very respectful and protective of the people he came in contact with in New Guinea, and in many ways he viewed them as more like his people than his family. And so after the Harvard University filmmakers wrapped up their documentary and went back to America, Michael had stayed in New Guinea. And in the meantime, his father, Nelson Rockefeller, had opened up a museum back home in New York called the Museum of Primitive Art, and what it displayed was artwork from places like New Guinea. Now, this was the early 1960s, and so many Westerners viewed natives of New Guinea, like the people of the Asmat tribe, as being very primitive and backwards. And so as a result, there was a lot of people that were drawn to this new museum in New York just for the spectacle of it, to see what these primitive backwards people were creating. But Michael felt like he had a deeper understanding of the natives of New Guinea, and he felt like it was his responsibility to go out and find the incredible artwork all around New Guinea, including like the Bispoles from the Asmat tribe, and send that artwork back to his father to be put up in this museum so that it was more than just a spectacle. Michael wanted the people of the West to appreciate and respect the natives of New Guinea the same way he did, and he believed through art he could do that. And so Michael had teamed up with René, the French anthropologist, to go all around New Guinea to find this artwork to send back to his dad. A few hours after Simon and Leo had leapt off the sinking catamaran and began their swim to shore, Michael and René had no idea if they'd even made it to shore. They hadn't seen anybody show up to rescue them, and so as far as they knew, they had no idea how close they were to being rescued or not. And as they looked down, they saw their catamaran was sinking lower and lower in the water. And so at some point, Michael and René just grabbed buckets and began bailing the water out of the catamaran, which was totally useless. The water was coming in way too quickly, but they had nothing else to do, and so they're bailing the water out, and then a rogue wave comes through and flips the entire catamaran over, sending Michael and René into the sea. And so luckily, Michael and René were able to swim to the surface. They swam over to the now upturned catamaran, but there was an air pocket kind of trapped underneath it, and so it was staying afloat. And so Michael and René grabbed onto the catamaran, and Michael actually grabbed a gas canister that had come off the boat, and he attached it to his belt like a flotation device. And so he and René just kind of held on to this upturned catamaran. Michael was also supported by this gas canister, and they just continued to wait, hoping that Simon and Leo had made it to shore and that help would be arriving soon. But in the back of Michael's mind, he knew that if help didn't come soon, Michael might have to do something drastic, like attempt the swim himself, which now was way farther than half a mile away. By the next morning, when the sun came up, Michael and René were still in the water, holding on to that catamaran, waiting for help to arrive, but no help had come. Now, Michael was a very good swimmer, but by this point, he knew they were at least 5 or maybe even 10 miles from shore. So this would be a gargantuan swim in pretty rough waters. But, Michael, he's a Rockefeller. He had a lot of confidence, and he began telling René that, hey, I'm going to do this swim. I know I can do it. I can swim the whole distance. Even if it's 10 miles, I can do it. You're going to have to just hang tight. It's going to take a while, but I'll get us help. René begged Michael not to go, but Michael said, I have to do something, otherwise we're gonna die out here. And so all Renee could do was watch as Michael stripped off some of his clothes and attached another gas canister to his belt to give him a little bit more flotation. And then Michael shook Renee's hand. And then right around 8 a.m. on Sunday, November 19th, 1961, Michael began the swim. About 12 hours later, so that night, while Renee is still just holding onto this catamaran, hoping help is going to come soon, suddenly, kind of without warning, the sky suddenly erupted with this incredibly bright flame. And what it was a plane flying overhead that had spotted Renee and the upturned catamaran. They had fired a flare into the air to be like, hey, we see you, we're going to send help. And then just a couple of hours later, a boat came around and picked Renee up. And when Renee climbed on board, he was so relieved, and he asked the captain, hey, did Michael Rockefeller tell you I was out here? Is that why you knew I was here? And the captain said, no, we were told by two teenagers, two guides, Simon and Leo, that you were out here. No one's heard from Michael. Now, you need to remember that Michael Rockefeller was a Rockefeller. And so as soon as Renee heard, oh my goodness, we don't know where Michael is, and he told the captain that Michael had begun this unbelievably long swim to shore to get help, it was like suddenly a bomb had gone off in the Rockefeller family, and they committed all of their money and their resources and their influence to launch the biggest manhunt basically ever to find Michael. They dispatched ships and helicopters and planes. They got in touch with the US Navy and got them to be fully involved. I mean, they looked everywhere for weeks, but they could not find Michael. This search for Michael would continue for years. Now, it wouldn't be as intense as the first few weeks, but there was always somebody or some entity looking for Michael around the area where he had begun that swim. But by 1964, so 3 years after Michael had begun the swim to shore, the Rockefeller family finally accepted that Michael had to be dead, that he had to have drowned on that 5 or 10 mile swim to shore. For the last 60 years, I've been a hardcore whale mail enthusiast. Every morning I wake up and I break out my quill and parchment and I draft up the various messages I need to send to my team. And then after slapping those in my backpack, I dive into the ocean and I swim out until I encounter a whale, and then I jump on its back and I spend 45 minutes wrestling with it until I've secured my packages to its hefty trunk, and then I leap off that beast, wish it good luck, swim to shore, and wait for my mail to get delivered. But despite how glorious this shipping system sounds, unfortunately, in the past 6 decades, not one whale has understood it was my courier, and so as a result, all of my mail has gone undelivered. So, after 60 years, I finally decided to give up on whale mail and join the future and entrust all of my shipping needs to Stamps.com. For 25 years, Stamps.com has been helping businesses save time and money. With Stamps.com, all you need is a computer and a printer. They even send you a free scale, so you'll have everything you need to get started. Stamps.com automatically tells you your cheapest and fastest shipping options. Also, you get access to all the USPS and UPS services that you need right from your computer anytime, day or night, no lines, no traffic, no waiting. So even though I know whale mail has a place in all of our hearts, it's time to free Willy and join Stamps.com. Set your business up for success when you get started with Stamps.com today. Sign up at Stamps.com/MrBallen for a special offer that includes a 4-week trial, plus free postage, and a free digital scale. No long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to Stamps.com/MrBallen.
Het woud roept ons met zijn mysterie. De zonsondergang kleurt de horizon. Oh, natuur, jouw plaats zo puur. In elke bloem, in elke boom. Oh, natuur, jouw hart zo groot. Jij bent de ziel van ons bestaan. Door de regen en door de sneeuw, jij blijft altijd staan. Onverwoestbaar en trouw.
And when the family finally kind of accepted that that is what happened, that became the story in America about what happened to Michael Rockefeller. In fact, his sister even wrote a best-selling book about grieving his loss. But in New Guinea, a very different story began to spread about what happened to Michael. Rumors about his fate were whispered along trade routes and between visiting missionaries and gossiped about in tabloid and adventure magazines. In 1969, so 5 years after Michael was declared dead by his family, an adventure magazine reporter named Milt Macklin heard from this mysterious Australian person who was a source for this magazine that they had actually run into Michael Rockefeller recently in the jungle of New Guinea, not far from where he supposedly disappeared. And Milt would actually follow up on this tip, despite how not credible it was, and he would go to New Guinea with a film crew, and he would go to this area and he would look everywhere for Michael. He would talk to locals. I mean, he really scoured the area, but there was no sign of Michael. And so Milt, feeling very let down by this, he came back home and he actually wrote a best-selling book about his quest to find Michael Rockefeller. But crucially, even though he had shot all this footage, both at a distance and up close, of all these tribes in the area where Michael supposedly was, he and his team never really reviewed the footage. They basically shot all this footage while they were there looking for Michael, couldn't find him, and said, meh, and put the footage aside. But 40 years later, another documentary film crew decided they were going to go to New Guinea and look for Michael, because there were still all these rumors floating around that Michael was alive and living in the jungles of New Guinea. And before they actually went to New Guinea to go looking for Michael, they uncovered this unwatched footage from Milt Macklin, and they watched all of it, and they discovered something unbelievable. Amongst the hours and hours of footage, there is this brief shot taken from a distance where the film crew is shooting on land out towards the water, and you see this canoe come into frame, and it's full of Asmat tribe warriors. This is a war party, and they're making their way presumably into battle with some other tribe. But amongst these big, strong men is one man who totally stands out because he doesn't look like the other Asmat warriors. He is a naked, bearded white man who, again, even though the quality of the film was poor, he totally looked like Michael Rockefeller. And so as soon as word got out about this footage, very quickly rumors began to spread all around the world about how this heir to a billionaire's fortune had decided to turn away from his family and just live amongst the Asmat tribe as one of theirs. Now, again, we have no idea if that really was Michael Rockefeller. It could easily have been, a missionary or some other white person that happened to be in New Guinea, but the story was incredible, and so it spread everywhere. In 2012, so 4 years after this unwatched Milt Macklin footage came to light, and over 50 years since Michael Rockefeller actually went missing, a National Geographic journalist named Carl Hoffman, who had grown up totally fascinated by the mystery surrounding Michael Rockefeller, he decided that he would go to New Guinea and finally get to the bottom of what happened to Michael Rockefeller. And after Carl and his interpreter went to New Guinea and lived with the Asmat tribe for months and gained their trust and gained their respect, they began to tell him a brand new story that he had never heard before about what happened to Michael. The real story. And they gave him a dire warning that if he ever told anyone what actually happened to Michael, that the whole village would likely be killed, and maybe even he too would be killed. But Carl didn't listen. After hearing what really happened to Michael, he left New Guinea and wrote a book about it called Savage Harvest. And from his book, here is what happened to Michael Rockefeller. On the morning of November 19th, 1961, so roughly 24 hours after Michael had jumped into the water and began this 5 to 10 mile swim to shore to get help, 3 Asmat tribe elders named Finn, Ajim, and Pep sat amongst 50 other tribe members in 8 long canoes. And they weren't going anywhere. They were just kind of resting at the mouth of this river, the same river that dumped out into the Arafura Sea, which is exactly where Michael and his crew had ran into all those rough waters and overturned, causing their whole situation. And so all these tribes people are just sitting there in their canoes. Some of them are smoking loosely wrapped cigars. Others are chewing on flour made from a palm plant called sago. And they're all naked, minus a couple of bands around their knees and their elbows, and some of them had very intricate piercings in their noses and their ears. but they're all just kind of sitting there. It was a long day and they're enjoying some peace and quiet. But then suddenly, Jim, one of the elders, noticed something making its way into the river from the sea. It was this white thing kind of slithering towards them, and immediately Jim called out to the others to look, there's something over there. It's a white crocodile, it's a serpent, it's something. And they all look and they're watching, and slowly this white thing is moving its way closer and closer to them. And so, not wanting to be caught off guard, the entire group got ready and began paddling over to see what this thing was, because if it was a threat, they could deal with it. If it wasn't, so be it. And so as these 8 canoes converged on this white thing, some of them had their spears up ready to attack. But when they finally saw what this creature was, they realized it was not some serpent or crocodile or something. It was a white man, and he was floating on his back, and he had these weird flotation devices on, but he was not a threat. And so right away, all the tribesmen, they put down their spears, they kind of laugh, thinking that they were in danger for a second. And this white man, who was Michael Rockefeller, he rolled over and he looked up and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He's just swam like 10 miles to get here, and he's seeing the tribe that he had come to see in the first place. They've come here to rescue him. And so, practically crying with relief, he turned around and grabbed one of their canoes. And as soon as he did, one of the elders, Pep, looked down at Michael holding onto his boat, and then Pep looked up at the other 2 elders, Finn and Jim, and they just stared at each other, then back at Michael, then back at each other, and then they nodded in agreement. And then Pep helped Michael into the boat. Michael immediately just laid in the middle of the boat. He was so exhausted from that swim, but he was so relieved, and he just laid there while the tribe kind of got back into position. They turned their canoes around and began paddling back up the river, back inland. And as they paddled, they began this very strange chant. All 8 canoes, all 50 plus members of the tribe, all in unison began this chant. And Michael, he had studied the Asmat tribe and felt like he knew a lot about their culture, but he had never heard this particular chant before. And so he was enchanted by it, and he tried to ask them, what does this mean? But they just completely ignored Michael and just continued to paddle and chant. And so Michael just laid there listening, getting carried along to safety, when all of a sudden the chanting stopped and the canoes turned and kind of made their way into this little inlet that led to a clearing right on the shore. And so Michael noticed they were slowing down, and so he kind of barely got up and looked over the edge of the canoe to see if they were at their village. But when he looked up, he saw there was no village in sight. It was just this clearing out on the shore. And right away, Michael's like, well, I hope we're going to the village soon, because I have to find someone who can get in touch with the authorities, who can then go and rescue Renee and hopefully find Simon and Leo as well. And so Michael began trying to ask the men in his canoe if they would help him, but there was, of course, a massive language barrier, and neither side really understood the other. And then at some point, one of the men from the Asmat tribe just began laughing at Michael. And when he did, the majority of the rest of the tribe looked over, saw what was going on, and they too began laughing at Michael. And so Michael had no idea what was going on. And then before he could do anything else, the entire tribe stopped laughing, and it was like in an instant, they were back into that rhythmic chanting as they slowly began making their way out of their canoes, making their way onto shore. And so Michael began to sense that something was wrong, and instead of getting out of the canoe with the rest of the tribe, he kind of instinctively laid back down on the canoe, almost like he was trying to get away from them. And when he did that, the tribesman who had first laughed at Michael, he stood right over Michael as he's doing this chant, and he smiled at Michael, and then he raised his spear and he drove it into Michael's side. And the second he did that, other members of the tribe raised these horns they were carrying and began blasting into their horns. And so Michael, he's screaming out in pain, but he's got no strength to defend himself. And so he kind of like rolled over onto the other side on this canoe, kind of trying to protect himself. And when he did that, the guy just lifted his spear again with a big smile on his face and drove it into Michael's other side. After the man pulled the spear out, Michael, who's in horrible pain, managed, perhaps with his adrenaline, to pull himself up and over the side of the canoe. So he kind of fell out onto the mud, and he tried to stand up to get away from them, but there was nowhere he could go. And so as he's kind of fumbling in the mud, 2 of the tribesmen walked up behind him, grabbed him under the arms, and they began carrying him across the clearing towards the jungle. And as they walked, that rhythmic chanting continued, and periodically Michael would hear someone blast on their horn. And so Michael was dragged across the shoreline into the jungle and then finally to another clearing in the jungle, not anywhere near their village. And Michael was positioned in the middle of this clearing and put on his knees. And so Michael, he's kind of guarding his sides with his arms. He's incredibly weak. He's on his knees. The tribe kind of formed a circle around him and they're continuing this chant. And then at some point, one of the tribesmen walked up to Michael, grabbed his head and pushed it forward, exposing the back of his neck. And then another tribe member walked in. And again, the whole time, this chanting is going on, horns are being blown. And this other tribesman comes up and he raises an axe and he brings it down on the back of Michael's neck. It would turn out the Asmat tribe knew who Michael was. They remembered him from his visit several months earlier when he had attempted to barter for their bis poles. And they had been totally offended that this rich white man had shown up and thought he could just buy one of their sacred artifacts like it was some trinket to be put on display in a museum. And so they had held on to a deep hatred for him. That was why they didn't send their bis pole to him. They weren't going to give it to him. But when Michael had kind of magically floated into their river and suddenly the Asmat tribe has him sitting in their canoe, the three village elders, Finn, Ajim, and Pep, they all just kind of looked at each other and nodded in agreement that they were going to ritualistically kill Michael to avenge the deaths of many of their fallen warriors that those bis poles apparently contained the souls of, because many of their warriors had been killed by white men in the past, and so Michael was going to be their way to avenge their souls. And so that chant that Michael heard them all saying, that was the chant they did when they performed this execution ritual. Except they didn't just kill Michael. After one of those tribesmen brought the axe down on the back of Michael's neck, another tribesman walked up and grabbed Michael's hair, pulled his head back, and used a knife to slash at his throat to actually remove his head. And then after his head was removed, again with all the chanting continuing in this circle the whole time, members of the tribe came up and began cutting Michael's body absolutely to pieces, separating his organs and his flesh and his bones into different piles, and then very quickly they got a fire going and cooked and ate Michael. And of all the parts of his body that were eaten, his brain was apparently the most important, and so only Finn, Ajim, and Pep, the three elders, were allowed to eat the brain. And then finally, after they had finished eating and took all the remaining meat that had not been consumed, and they put it into their pouches to eat later, Finn, one of the elders, took Michael's skull, and he would bring it back to the village, and he would cover it in banana leaves, and he would paint it, and treat it like a trophy. A few days later, when that huge search party came through the area looking for Michael, the Asmat tribe knew they could never whisper a word about what happened to Michael, because if it got out, it's very likely that Westerners would want to retaliate against them. And so for decades and decades, their secret stayed safe until Carl Hoffman of the National Geographic heard the story and then wrote the book about it, Savage Harvest. But despite publishing this book and lots of people reading it, there was always some question about the credibility of the story, because remember, there's all this intrigue and mystery around Michael's story to begin with, and now we have this account coming from the Asmat tribe, and so no one really knew how legitimate it was. And so to this day, the Rockefeller family, and generally speaking, authorities at large, still say that Michael Rockefeller drowned on his swim to shore trying to get help, and that's it.